For more on the workings of the UK and Scottish governments during the EU negotiations, I spoke to Maddy Thimont Jack from the Institute for Government, a think tank working to make government more effective. Has Brexit fractured relations between Westminster and Holyrood?
Well, I think if we look at the start of the Brexit process, Theresa May did try and reach out to the Scottish Government and also the government in Wales to say that she wanted this to be a sort of cross-UK exercise. Unfortunately, that didn't really play out that way, particularly, as I say, the first year or so after the referendum, where there wasn't much consultation with the Scottish Government, and I think there was a lot of frustration about not being involved. More recently, I think the UK Government has tried to reach out to Nicola Sturgeon and her ministers sort of better, but I think the sort of underlying crux of the matter is that the relationship between Scotland and the UK government wasn't very positive to start with, and it was compounded by the fact that Scotland voted to remain while England and Wales didn't, and that has been an issue as the Scottish government's position on Brexit has been so different from the UK government's sort of going into negotiations.
There's been a lot of debate about whether there needs to be a Secretary of State for Scotland. What's your view on that?
I do think that what can be helpful is having a minister in cabinet who actually reminds the UK government that Scotland is, part of the UK, and actually to try and take into account some of the interests in sort of Scottish interests when making decisions in government. I think there's maybe is a question about whether you have a specific Secretary of State for Scotland or whether you have a Secretary of State for the sort of other UK territory, so the other UK nations, so for Wales and Northern Ireland as well, sort of have one Secretary of State representing those interests. But I don't necessarily think that removing that representation in cabinet would be a useful way of ensuring that Scotland's interests sort of continue to be represented.
More broadly on Brexit, has Brexit exposed at a UK level a failure of government?
I think the first thing to say is that the scale of the Brexit task is something that we haven't seen before. So once Article 50 was triggered, we knew there was a 2-year ticking clock, in which time the government had to both negotiate, it had to legislate and implement Brexit scenarios, some of which were changing constantly. So I think for the civil service, for example, it's been a heroic effort to try and get the UK in a position where it will be ready to leave under different scenarios, whether that's no deal or with a negotiated deal. But I do think what's been challenging and what we've seen is the relationship between government and parliament has really broken down during the Brexit process. And I'd say government's handling of parliament has not been very good. And that's part of the challenge at the moment, that the government is having this almost face-off with its MPs to try and get the deal through.
Is Brexit a failure of government, or is it more accurately a failure of politics?
In the UK, we traditionally have more of a two-party system in Westminster, and usually they sort of sit on opposite sides of one issue. What Brexit has done is it's split the parties in different ways, which means that it's not as straightforward as maybe normal big policy decisions would be, where you had Labour MPs consistently voting with the government and then a contingent of Conservative MPs voting against them. And I think that's what we've seen play out, and that's what's made it quite difficult. And I think that's definitely been compounded by the fact that we've got a minority government, which means it's harder for Theresa May to get her deal through.
Maddy Thimont Jack, thank you very much indeed.